How do you go about doing a PhD? How do you plan and organize for such a huge task that it's maybe going to take up 3 or 4 or more years of your life? Let me talk you through my thoughts. Hello everyone, welcome to The Attic. My name's Mark Jago. I'm a philosophy professor in the UK. In this video, I wanted to share a few thoughts with you guys about how you might go about doing a PhD. So I'm going to be talking about the process of doing a PhD more or less from start to finish. So I'm not going to be talking about how you apply for a PhD, how you get accepted, how you get funding or anything like that. And I'm not going to be talking about stuff at the other end, like getting published, getting a job with a PhD. I'm not going to be talking about managing teaching commitments and things like that. I'm just going to be talking about the PhD itself. Okay, so if that sounds good to you guys, you can do me a favor before we get going. You can give this video a thumbs up. That helps me reach more people on YouTube. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to get notifications. There's basically 2 big things that you're doing when you're doing a PhD. There's the PhD itself, the thing that you write, the massive, great big book-like thing. But then there is the learning and the research that you're doing during that PhD. So doing a PhD is both doing the research and also producing this big book-like thing by the end of that time. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on philosophy PhDs because that's basically what I know about, and I'm going to be talking about the UK context where you typically do a PhD for 3 or 4 years. So if you're doing a full-time PhD in the UK, you get 3 years of tuition, that is supervision, plus you get a writing up year at the end. Okay, so we have these 2 really big, daunting tasks to think about. First, we've got all the research to do, and then at some point we have to start writing that up into our thesis. People usually think about it in that way, right? They think, right, first there's all the research, how am I going to do that? That's really, really troubling. And then there's the writing. How am I going to do that? That's an extra problem. What I'm going to suggest is that actually we think about it in the other direction. We begin our PhD, maybe at some point during the first year, we think about what is our thesis going to look like? What kind of structure is it going to have? What kind of stuff, in outline, is going to go in there? And then we use that to make sense of how we actually go about doing our research. Okay, so I'm really going to be talking about planning a thesis here and using that plan to structure our research. Now, whenever you do a plan, right, stuff doesn't always go to plan. So maybe what's going to happen is you start off with a rough and ready plan, and as your research progresses, stuff changes. That's absolutely fine. That always happens. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have a plan in the first place. So the idea is you do a plan that helps you structure your time, structure your research, and if the plan changes, you change the plan. What would a good plan for a thesis look like? One thing you've absolutely got to show is knowledge of the literature. You've got to show the examiner that you know your stuff in whichever area you've picked, okay? So the thesis has to kind of read like, I am an expert in this area. Second thing you've got to show is academic skill in some ways. So the kind of skills I've got are the skills of an academic relevant to whatever field you're working in. So if we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about discussing philosophical views in an accurate and an intelligent way, and you're critiquing those views, you're criticizing them, you're pointing out, here are the good bits, here are the bad bits, and on balance, I think this view is or isn't a sustainable view. And the third thing is your PhD should make some kind of contribution to the literature, so some kind of originality in there. It can't merely be cobbling together stuff that's already out there. There should be some kind of new thoughts in the thesis at some point. That could be a tricky thing for a lot of people. I'm going to say a little bit about that kind of later on. Okay, so we need to think about those 3 things when we are planning out a rough and ready structure for our thesis. So I'm going to suggest that in the UK, a philosophy PhD should be something like 60,000 words long. Maybe your department, school, whatever, has a word limit, a lower or an upper. I'm going to suggest you go closer to the lower limit because it's less work for you. And you've also got to bear in mind somebody has to read this in order to examine you. And if they're kind of going through it and thinking, oh, this is just longer than it needs to be, if you want someone who's reading your stuff to be on your side, well, you want to say the things as clearly and concisely as you can. Okay, so what would a plan for a PhD thesis look like? Well, let's suppose that your thesis is going to be on some particular problem, right? Some philosophical issue. Let's just call it the problem of X, all right? X might be what's the right analysis of the mind. It might be what's the right theory of causation, or what's the right theory of gender. Or it might be something more specific like, discussing Sally Haslanger's view of gender and race and critiquing it and working out whether it's accurate or whatever, or something even more specific than that, so does Sally Haslanger's theory of gender have enough room in it for trans women? That's probably about as narrow as you'd want to get for a thesis topic. But X here could be lots and lots of different things. Okay, we're just going to talk generically about your thesis on X. How would you plan it out? So here are some of the things that you might put in your thesis. You might start off with a clear statement of the problem. Okay, you've always got to have that if you're writing an essay or whatever. In a thesis length thing, you might want to go into a little bit more detail on stating the problem. By stating the problem, I don't just mean writing out a few lines about what people think the problem is. You've got to basically convince people that this is a problem. Why can't it be solved easily? How is it going to be solvable? What kind of theories try to solve it, etc., etc. What are the consequences of solving it? All of that stuff. You could easily write a chapter on just setting out why it's a super important problem. Another thing you might well do is a literature review. As a chapter in a thesis, that's kind of boring, just kind of listing this person says this person says that. So I wouldn't strictly do it as a literature review. But it's a good idea to be starting off a thesis by situating the problem in the literature and kind of getting a feel for all the different moves that people have made leading up to this point, okay? This helps with a whole bunch of things. One thing it helps with is saying to the examiner, you really know the literature because you're discussing it all. It also helps to situate the kind of stuff that you're going to talk about later in the thesis, okay? So why are you talking about all this stuff? Why is your positive view that you're going to bring into the thesis original and new? And why do you say this and why don't you do this? Well, you kind of deal with all that stuff in this chapter on sketching out all the different moves that people have made in the literature so far. That really, really helps with situating all the stuff that's going to follow in the thesis. It doesn't have to be super detailed. You're trying to cover a wide area in this chapter. Then, typically, you're going to be going into more detail about some of the things that people have said already and critiquing them, evaluating them, and kind of pointing out why they don't work. Okay, so you don't just jump into your super good solution to the problem. If you do that, you're probably going to have a thesis that's way too short. But also, you're not really engaging with what other people have said, okay? So typically what you're going to be doing in this middle part of the thesis is saying, well, here's one theory that already exists about X, and I don't think it works for these reasons. And next chapter, here's another theory about X, and I don't think it works for these reasons, okay? So you might have a couple of chapters doing that. So I've listed 3 here, but it might be 2, it might be 4, something like that. In these chapters, you're not merely just repeating what people have said, you're critiquing them, okay? So you're saying why they aren't perfectly good solutions. I mean, if they were good solutions, you wouldn't need to be writing a new thesis on this topic, right? So you're trying to explain what's wrong with these theories. These objections, they might be ones that already exist in the literature, or they might be ones that you've come up with. Ideally, you're going to have to do a bit of stuff that's original in these chapters. Otherwise, if you're really just kind of pointing out that this person says this and this person objects, really there's nothing new there. That said, it doesn't have to be all new stuff that you've come up with. There can be plenty of stuff in these chapters where you're looking at other views that bring in kind of other arguments, stuff that's already been published. That's absolutely fine. But you want a bit of your own thoughts in there and kind of the way that you put these things together, the way you kind of weave through those conversations, that really should be coming from you. Okay, then we're getting into the really interesting bits of the thesis. This is where you're going to be putting forward your own original solutions to the problem. So you've set it all up by, describing the problem, sketching the literature, explaining why other approaches don't work. So this is where you say what you think does work. You might want to spend a few chapters doing this. Typically what you might do is you might spend 1 chapter explaining your view, setting out clearly what the view is, and then another chapter in which you, for instance, sketch out some consequences of it, or point out some objections that people might have and explain why those objections don't really hold. Something like that. So a couple of chapters which kind of put forward your own positive view. Then at the end, you're going to have a short conclusion. Keep the conclusion short. You're basically just reminding the examiner, the person reading your thesis, what you've done in the thesis and kind of reiterating what the main take-home messages are. So that conclusion is going to be quite short relative to the other chapters. Typically, these chapters want to be something like 8 to 10,000 words long each. If you're going longer than 10,000 words, maybe you've got 2 chapters there rather than just 1. And if you did 7 or 8 chapters like that, you'd end up with about 60,000 words. Okay, so let's just check that that plan ticks off those 3 things that we really want to have in a thesis. So first up, knowledge of the literature. Well, yeah, we've got that both in the literature review, but also when we're thinking about, for instance, what are the objections to your own view? Okay, so if there's stuff in the literature that would potentially be an objection to your view, and you don't discuss it, that looks like you haven't got enough knowledge of the literature. But on the other hand, if you're saying, well, I've come up with this brand new view, but there is a potential problem that relates to this other problem in the literature, blah, 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 and here's why it doesn't work, then you're demonstrating good knowledge of the literature. So if you do this plan well, yep, you're going to be demonstrating knowledge of the literature. Academic skill, well, yeah, you're going through and you're critiquing other people's views, you're saying what's wrong with them, you're evaluating them, you're balancing them up, and then you're doing the same thing with your own view, right? You're talking about potential problems and why they don't really affect the view. That's all demonstrating your philosophical skill. What about originality? Well, that's coming in primarily in presenting and defending your own positive view of topic X, but also in the way that you evaluate the other theories in chapters maybe 3, 4, 5. Okay, so if you follow through a plan like this, yep, you're going to get the right kind of balance of those 3 things, knowledge of the literature, academic skill, originality. In saying originality, I'm not saying that every single chapter you write here has to have something interesting or original in it. Typically the statement of the problem might be very kind of conventional. The literature review thing might be quite conventional and boring. The originality kind of gets ramped up as you go through, as you start discussing other people's views, and particularly when you're presenting your own, your positive view. That's where the originality is really going to come into it. How does that actually help you with your research through years 1, 2, and 3 of the thesis? Well, it goes like this, right? You know that you're going to have to first up have a clear statement of the problem and do a literature review. So I'm suggesting that's a good thing to be writing in the first year. If you're going to be thinking about topic X, you've got to know a lot about what people have said about it. So spend some time in that first year reading as much stuff as you can on that topic. And for each thing you read, write, like, let's say a paragraph about it, evaluating it. That kind of makes up your literature review. The more you read about the topic and surrounding areas, the clearer an idea you're going to get of how to express what the problem is all about. Get that stuff written down. That's going to make up your first chapter outlining the problem. So I'm suggesting that in the first year, you definitely want to have something like chapters 1 and 2 drafted out and be thinking about what you're going to do in chapters 3, 4, and 5 when you are describing and critiquing and evaluating other solutions that are already out there. So that's your job for year 1. In year 2, maybe you're going to be writing up chapters 3, 4, and 5. So this is the stuff where you're, critiquing the other views that are already out there. You're going to be thinking about, okay, what are, let's say, the 3 biggest, most important views out there? Which ones are you going to discuss? And how are you going to evaluate them? What's wrong about them? Okay, why is your eventual view going to be superior to these? That's your job for the second year in terms of writing. But also, you're going to be wanting to think about what is your positive solution going to be. You don't have to have that fixed in the second year, but you've got to be thinking about it because typically it's going to take you longer than a year to think through. So in the second year, as well as writing chapters 3, 4, and 5-ish, you're thinking about what your positive view is going to look like. Third year of the thesis, you are basically nailing that positive view in terms of getting it all worked out and getting it written up. Once it's written up, you're thinking about what are the potential objections. You're going to know about those because you've done your literature review in year 1. And you're going to be writing, okay, why doesn't that objection completely damage your theory? How can your theory overcome that objection? You're writing those kind of things in the third year. I think you want to aim to have all of these chapters drafted like almost like a final draft, something that somebody could read and make sense of by the end of the third year. So yes, in the UK system, you have this extra writing up year, but I don't think you want to leave all of your thesis writing to the writing up year. I think by the end of the third year, you want pretty much all of chapters 1 to 7 drafted, like a final draft. Then that final time can be, writing an introduction if you want one, writing the conclusion, revising all of those chapters, because by the time you've got to the end of the third year, you're going to want to go back to the stuff you did in the first year and kind of bring it up to the new standard that you are now. Maybe in that final writing up year, you're going to have other commitments like teaching, searching for a job, that kind of thing. Lots of things get in the way of finishing that PhD, okay? So don't leave all the writing to the last year, get most of it done in the third year, and just leave a little bit for that final writing up year. So like I said at the beginning, this plan that I'm talking about here is really, really rough and ready. It will change as you go through. It will be different for different people. So it's meant to just give you a rough overview of A, what's the thesis going to look like, and B, what are you going to be doing on that thesis in your research at different stages of your PhD. So yeah, it's really rough and ready, but I hope it gives you some kind of useful idea of how to go about things. Okay guys, thank you for listening this far. I hope you found it useful. If you have, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon. I really appreciate it. If you've got questions, leave me a comment down below. I'm going to try and answer all of them. Thank you once again, and I hope to see you back here soon.